This was not a prince who retired quietly from military service. This was a man whose career, his freedom, and his future were ripped away from him because he loved the wrong person. Prince Francis Joseph of Braganza lost everything in a single moment when Austrian military authorities discovered what they called his indiscretions, and the empire he served made certain he would never recover. The forced resignation came without ceremony or honor. One day, Lieutenant Francis Joseph commanded respect in the 7th Hussars Regiment of the Austro-Hungarian Army. The next, his commission was terminated and his name struck from military records. The prince, who had worn his uniform with pride, found himself stripped of rank, title, and the only profession that had given his exiled life meaning. What followed was even more devastating. Austrian court proceedings declared the prince mentally unsound, not because of any illness, but because of whom he had chosen to love. His personal affairs, his finances, his very autonomy were placed under the control of a trustee. His brother-in-law, Prince Charles Louis of Thurn, on Taxis. Francis Joseph had become a prisoner of the system he once served. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. Prince Francis Joseph Gerard, Maria, George Humbert, Anthony Henry, Michael Raphael Gabriel of Braganza had been born into Portuguese royalty in exile, carrying the bloodline of kings who once ruled from Lisbon to Brazil. Military service in the Habsburg Empire had offered him purpose, respect, and a pathway to rebuild the honor his family had lost when Portuguese monarchy fell. Documented records from Austrian military archives show he had served with distinction before his world collapsed. But court memoranda reveal that surveillance had been tracking the prince's private life long before his public disgrace. The Habsburg system, like royal courts across Europe, maintained extensive networks monitoring the sexual conduct of nobility. What they discovered about Francis Joseph's relationships triggered institutional machinery designed to contain and punish transgression. The Austrian court's response was swift and absolute. Military dismissal was only the beginning. Legal proceedings stripped him of his autonomy under the guise of mental protection, ensuring he could never again move freely through royal or military circles. The prince found himself legally imprisoned while technically free, a condition that would define the rest of his brief life. Contemporary accounts indicate this was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern. European courts had developed sophisticated methods for neutralizing royals whose private lives threatened institutional stability. Francis Joseph had become another casualty in a war fought in shadows, using legal weapons designed to destroy without leaving visible scars. What the archival files don't immediately reveal is how much deeper the surveillance went. The records that survived suggest Austrian authorities knew far more about the prince's private relationships than they formally documented, and there were more incidents to come. Scandals that would drive Francis Joseph even further from the protection of royal circles into the hands of predators waiting to exploit his desperation. The prince who had lost everything was about to discover that his enemies were only beginning their work. Archival records from the Portuguese royal exile reveal that Prince Francis Joseph of Braganza was born into a dynasty that had lost everything but its bloodline. The House of Braganza had once ruled an empire stretching from Lisbon to Brazil, commanding fleets that controlled Atlantic trade routes and territories that made Portugal a global power. By the time Francis Joseph was born in 1879, that empire existed only in memory and legal documents stored in Austrian palaces. Court genealogies document his position as a member of the Miguelist branch of Braganza, descended from the deposed King Miguel III. When the Portuguese monarchy fell in 1910, these records became more than historical curiosities. They represented potential claims to a throne that Portuguese Republicans were determined would never be restored. Francis Joseph carried royal blood that made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to multiple European power systems. His path into Austrian military service was not accidental, but strategic. Diplomatic correspondence shows that Habsburg authorities welcomed Portuguese royal exiles as useful assets in their complex web of European alliance building. A Braganza prince, wearing Austrian uniform, sent clear messages about Habsburg influence over displaced royalty. Military service offered Francis Joseph purpose, while serving Austrian interests in maintaining control over potentially destabilizing royal bloodlines. Contemporary military records indicate Francis Joseph had embraced his role as a Habsburg officer with genuine dedication. The 7th Hussar Regiment represented one of the empire's most prestigious cavalry units, and advancement to lieutenant rank suggested both competence and institutional trust. For a prince without a kingdom, military rank provided identity, honor, and the respect that his exiled royal title alone could no longer command. But preserved intelligence files reveal the impossible position this created. Francis Joseph lived suspended between two incompatible worlds: the Austrian Empire that employed him and the Portuguese royal traditions that defined his identity. Habsburg authorities needed him visible enough to demonstrate their control over displaced royalty, yet contained enough to prevent him from becoming a rallying point for monarchist restoration movements. This surveillance extended far beyond political activities. Confidential memoranda indicate Austrian court officials monitored the personal lives of all displaced royals under their protection. They understood that sexual scandals could be weaponized against troublesome princes, or used to justify removing them from positions where they might become inconvenient. The system was designed to manufacture compliance through constant threat of exposure. What Francis Joseph likely never realized was how thoroughly his private relationships were being documented. Intelligence reports suggest Austrian authorities had been building files on his personal associations long before any public incident. They knew that displaced royals were particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and personal scandals that could destroy their remaining status. The prince, who thought he had found security in Austrian military service, was actually living under a surveillance system designed to control him. Every relationship, every friendship, every private moment was potentially being recorded by officials who understood that knowledge was power, and that scandals were weapons waiting to be deployed. When that weapon was finally triggered, Francis Joseph would discover that the empire he served had been preparing for his destruction all along. The Austrian military tribunal files that destroyed Prince Francis Joseph contain language deliberately designed to obscure while condemning. Official records refer only to indiscretions and incidents that led to his forced resignation from the 7th Hussars Regiment. But preserved court memoranda reveal these euphemisms concealed documented evidence of homosexual conduct that Habsburg authorities had been collecting for months before striking. Military surveillance reports indicate the prince's relationships had been monitored through a network of informants embedded within officer social circles. Austrian court officials maintained detailed intelligence on the private associations of all foreign royals under their protection, understanding that sexual scandal represented the most effective method of neutralizing potentially troublesome nobility. Francis Joseph's activities had triggered protocols designed specifically for containing royal transgression. Court documents reveal the systematic nature of Habsburg sexual surveillance. Intelligence files show officials documented not only the prince's relationships, but also meeting locations, correspondence, and financial expenditures that suggested intimate associations. This evidence was compiled into formal reports that would later be used to justify his removal from military service and the legal proceedings that stripped him of personal autonomy. The tribunal proceedings themselves were conducted with calculated discretion. Austrian authorities understood that public trials would generate unwanted attention around royal sexual scandal, potentially damaging Habsburg credibility in managing displaced European nobility. Instead, court records show Francis Joseph was quietly processed through administrative channels designed to destroy his position while maintaining plausible institutional distance from the explicit reasons. Preserved legal documents detail how the prince was declared mentally unsound following his military dismissal. This diagnosis was not based on medical evidence, but on court determination that his sexual conduct demonstrated psychological instability requiring institutional protection. The legal mechanism had been refined through previous cases involving European royals whose private lives threatened dynastic stability. What makes these files particularly revealing is their clinical documentation of institutional machinery most courts preferred to keep invisible. Habsburg officials understood they were establishing precedent for managing sexual transgression among displaced European royalty, and their records demonstrate sophisticated legal frameworks designed to neutralize threats while avoiding public scandal. Intelligence memoranda indicate Austrian authorities had been coordinating with Portuguese exile leadership about Francis Joseph's conduct. Court officials recognized that sexual scandal could be used to permanently discredit potential claimants to the Portuguese throne, serving both Habsburg interests in controlling displaced royalty and Portuguese Republican interests in preventing monarchist restoration. The legal proceedings that followed military dismissal were designed to ensure Francis Joseph could never recover his position or credibility. Placing his affairs under trustee control eliminated his financial independence while creating permanent legal barriers to future military or political involvement. The prince had been systematically isolated from all sources of institutional support. But court files also reveal what Habsburg authorities feared most: that other European courts were watching to see how they handled royal sexual transgression. Intelligence reports suggest concern that lenient treatment might encourage similar conduct among other displaced royals under Austrian protection, while excessive publicity might damage Habsburg reputation for discretion in managing sensitive aristocratic scandals. The documentation preserved in Austrian archives represents more than evidence of one prince's destruction. These files illuminate institutional systems designed to monitor, control, and eliminate royal threats through manufactured sexual scandal, mechanisms that remained active throughout European courts long after Francis Joseph's case was closed. Contemporary accounts from Austrian court circles reveal that Prince Francis Joseph's disgrace created immediate social isolation that devastated his remaining connections throughout European nobility. Diplomatic correspondence indicates former associates distanced themselves rapidly once news of his military dismissal spread through Habsburg social networks. The prince, who had once moved freely among Austrian aristocracy, found himself systematically excluded from gatherings he had previously attended as an honored guest. Preserved letters from this period document the calculated cruelty with which European royal circles abandoned Francis Joseph. Portuguese exile leadership, according to diplomatic reports, quietly communicated their disapproval to other courts, ensuring the prince would find no refuge among his own displaced compatriots. The message was clear: sexual transgression made him a liability that no royal faction could afford to shelter. Intelligence files suggest Francis Joseph attempted to maintain correspondence with former military colleagues and royal associates, but evidence indicates these relationships were systematically severed through institutional pressure. Habsburg authorities, court records show, monitored his communications and discouraged continued contact through both official channels and informal social pressure applied to his former associates. What emerges from surviving documentation is a portrait of deliberate social annihilation. Austrian officials understood that destroying Francis Joseph's personal connections was as important as removing his official positions. Contemporary accounts suggest the prince experienced profound isolation as friends, colleagues, and even distant royal cousins were pressured to sever ties with him entirely. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. Banking records preserved in Austrian archives reveal the financial pressure that accompanied social ostracism. With his military salary terminated and his affairs under trustee control, Francis Joseph found himself dependent on allowances determined by his brother-in-law, Prince Charles Louis of Thurn on taxes. This financial dependency created additional leverage for controlling his behavior and limiting his ability to establish new social connections. Court memoranda indicate Austrian authorities were particularly concerned about preventing Francis Joseph from establishing relationships with other displaced royals who might be vulnerable to similar scandals. Intelligence reports suggest officials monitored his movements and social contacts to ensure he could not become a rallying point for royal sexual transgression or encourage similar conduct among other nobles under Habsburg protection. But preserved intelligence files reveal that Francis Joseph's isolation was about to become even more complete. Confidential reports indicate Austrian authorities had documented evidence of additional homosexual conduct that had occurred after his initial disgrace. This second incident would provide justification for even more severe institutional control, while demonstrating that his removal from military service had failed to modify his behavior. The correspondence that survives from this period suggests Francis Joseph was unaware of how thoroughly he was being monitored, or how much additional evidence was being compiled against him. Court officials had established surveillance protocols designed to document any continued sexual transgression that could be used to justify permanent removal from royal circles entirely. Contemporary accounts indicate the prince believed his disgrace was limited to military dismissal and social isolation. What he did not understand was that Habsburg authorities were building a case for total institutional control that would eliminate any possibility of his rehabilitation or return to European royal society. The second scandal was already being documented, and this time there would be no opportunity for discretion. Austrian court records detail the legal mechanism that transformed Prince Francis Joseph from a disgraced officer into a legally controlled prisoner. The appointment of his brother-in-law, Prince Charles Louis of Thurn-on-Taxis, as trustee was presented as protective intervention for a mentally unstable royal. But preserved legal documentation reveals this arrangement created total institutional control over every aspect of Francis Joseph's remaining life. The trustee system represented refined Habsburg expertise in managing troublesome nobility without generating public scandal. Court documents show similar arrangements had been used previously to neutralize European royals whose conduct threatened dynastic stability. By declaring Francis Joseph mentally unsound, Austrian authorities created legal justification for permanent supervision while avoiding the publicity that formal imprisonment would generate. Under trustee control, every financial transaction required approval. Banking records preserved in Austrian archives show Prince Charles Louis monitored and restricted Francis Joseph's expenditures, preventing him from establishing independent living arrangements or maintaining social connections that might threaten continued institutional oversight. The prince had been transformed into a legal dependent under permanent supervision. But intelligence files reveal the trustee arrangement served additional purposes beyond financial control. Confidential memoranda indicate Prince Charles Louis was expected to monitor Francis Joseph's personal relationships and report any evidence of continued sexual transgression. The trustee functioned as both jailer and informant, ensuring Austrian authorities maintained complete surveillance over the disgraced prince's private life. Contemporary court records document that this surveillance quickly produced results. Intelligence reports indicate Francis Joseph was implicated in another homosexual incident in Austria after his affairs had been placed under trustee control. This second scandal provided Habsburg authorities with evidence that legal supervision had failed to modify his behavior, justifying even more severe restrictions on his movements and associations. The timing of this second incident, according to preserved documentation, was particularly damaging. Austrian officials had been monitoring Francis Joseph's activities specifically to document continued transgression that would demonstrate the inadequacy of current control measures. Intelligence files suggest this evidence was used to argue for permanent exile from Austrian territories entirely. What makes the trustee documentation particularly revealing is its clinical approach to destroying royal autonomy. Legal records show Habsburg authorities had developed standardized procedures for managing sexual transgression among displaced European nobility, creating institutional frameworks that could neutralize threats while maintaining plausible legal justification for extreme control measures. Court memoranda indicate the second homosexual incident eliminated any remaining sympathy Francis Joseph might have retained among Austrian officials or European royal circles. Intelligence reports suggest Portuguese exile leadership was informed of this additional transgression, ensuring he would be permanently excluded from any future restoration movements or royal recognition. The trustee arrangement had achieved its intended purpose: total isolation and institutional control. But preserved intelligence files reveal Austrian authorities understood this level of supervision was unsustainable long-term. Confidential reports indicate officials were already considering options for permanent removal of Francis Joseph from European court circles entirely. The prince, who had lost his military career, his social connections, and his financial independence, was about to discover that predators had been watching his destruction unfold. They understood that a legally controlled royal with limited supervision and desperate isolation represented the perfect target for sophisticated criminal exploitation. Police records from Paris and Vienna document how Prince Francis Joseph's legal isolation made him a perfect target for sophisticated criminal exploitation. In November 1909, the prince lost 325 €, to a con artist named William Lackestein Joachim, who had been impersonating Frederick Dennehy Vanderbilt of the American Vanderbilt dynasty. Court documentation reveals this was not a random crime, but a carefully planned operation targeting a vulnerable royal whose institutional protection had been deliberately removed. The swindle began in Paris in April 1909, where Joachim first approached Francis Joseph with offers to sell valuable emeralds and shares in an English mining company. Police intelligence files indicate the criminal had been tracking the prince's movements and financial situation, understanding that his legal isolation and limited supervision created unprecedented opportunity for large-scale fraud targeting European royalty. What made Francis Joseph particularly vulnerable was his desperate need for financial independence from trustee control. Banking records show the prince was seeking investments that might restore his autonomy and social position. Joachim exploited this desperation by offering opportunities that appeared to promise both wealth and the social connections that institutional persecution had destroyed. Contemporary police reports detail how Joachim traveled to Vienna a month after their initial meeting, throwing an elaborate dinner for Francis Joseph that demonstrated apparent wealth and social standing. The criminal understood that displaced royals craved the respect and recognition they had lost, making them susceptible to manipulation by anyone who offered to restore their former status. Intelligence files reveal the sophistication of Joachim's operation. The criminal had researched Vanderbilt family connections and created convincing documentation supporting his false identity. Police reports indicate he had specifically targeted Francis Joseph after learning of his legal vulnerabilities and social isolation through networks of informants operating within European royal circles. The financial loss was devastating, but court records suggest the emotional manipulation was equally destructive. Joachim had offered Francis Joseph not only investment opportunities, but also the possibility of social rehabilitation through association with American financial elite. For a prince who had been systematically isolated from European society, these promises represented hope for rebuilding his destroyed reputation. What emerges from police documentation is evidence of criminal networks that specifically targeted legally vulnerable royals. Intelligence reports indicate Joachim was part of organized operations that monitored European courts for displaced nobility whose institutional protection had been compromised, making them accessible for exploitation that would previously have been impossible. Austrian authorities' response to the swindle reveals their continued surveillance of Francis Joseph. Court records show officials were fully informed of the criminal exploitation, but made no efforts to provide protection or assistance. Intelligence memoranda suggest they viewed the incident as confirmation of their assessment that the prince's judgment remained fundamentally compromised. The timing of the swindle, according to preserved documentation, coincided with increasing pressure from Portuguese exile leadership to permanently exclude Francis Joseph from any restoration planning. Criminal exploitation provided additional evidence that he had become a liability who could not be trusted with sensitive political or financial responsibilities. But police files also reveal that Joachim's success encouraged other criminal operations to target Francis Joseph. Intelligence reports indicate the prince had become known within European criminal networks as an accessible royal whose isolation made him vulnerable to repeated exploitation. The predators were circling closer, and institutional protection that might have shielded other royals had been deliberately withdrawn from the prince who had lost everything. Portuguese military archives document Prince Francis Joseph's participation in the desperate monarchist uprisings of 1911-1912, led by Henrique Michel de Paiva Cucheiro against the First Portuguese Republic. For a prince who had lost everything to institutional persecution, these failed rebellions represented a final attempt to reclaim honor through warfare against the republican system that had destroyed his family's throne. Intelligence reports from this period reveal Francis Joseph's complex position within Portuguese exile politics. Contemporary accounts indicate his father and older brother had offered to renounce their claims to the Portuguese throne in an attempt to unite monarchist support behind the deposed King Manuel II. This gesture of dynastic sacrifice positioned Francis Joseph as a potential rival claimant, making him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to restoration planning. Military correspondence preserved in Portuguese archives shows Cucheiro's recognition of Francis Joseph's unique status among potential royal leaders. The prince carried legitimate Braganza bloodline while being permanently excluded from Austrian protection and European court recognition. His institutional isolation made him available for high-risk military operations that established royals could never publicly support. But intelligence files suggest Francis Joseph's participation was motivated by desperation rather than strategic calculation. Contemporary accounts indicate the prince understood these uprisings represented his only remaining opportunity to restore royal status through military achievement. Having been systematically destroyed by institutional scandal, warfare offered the possibility of rebuilding reputation through demonstrated courage and royal leadership. The rebellions themselves were doomed from the start. Portuguese Republican intelligence reports document superior government forces and limited popular support for monarchist restoration. Contemporary military analysis indicates Cucheiro's operations lacked the financial resources, foreign support, and domestic coordination necessary for successful overthrow of the established republican system. What makes Francis Joseph's involvement particularly tragic is evidence suggesting he understood the hopeless nature of these operations. Preserved correspondence indicates the prince recognized these rebellions would likely fail, but participated anyway because institutional persecution had eliminated all alternative paths to rehabilitation or recognition. Military records reveal the uprising's swift collapse under Republican counterattacks. Intelligence reports document monarchist forces scattered and leadership captured or forced into deeper exile. Francis Joseph's participation had failed to restore his royal status while further confirming his reputation as a destabilizing influence unsuitable for serious political responsibility. Contemporary accounts suggest Portuguese exile leadership used Francis Joseph's military involvement as additional evidence supporting his permanent exclusion from restoration planning. Intelligence files indicate Republican authorities were informed of his participation, ensuring he would be permanently marked as an enemy of the Portuguese state, regardless of future political developments. The failed uprisings eliminated Francis Joseph's last connection to Portuguese royal politics. Court records show European monarchist networks had been monitoring his involvement, using his participation in failed military operations as confirmation that his judgment remained fundamentally compromised by previous scandals and institutional persecution. But preserved intelligence files reveal the prince's military involvement had attracted attention from other quarters. Austrian authorities, according to confidential reports, had been tracking his activities during the Portuguese uprisings, understanding that his continued political involvement represented potential complications for Habsburg management of displaced European royalty. The war that would consume all of Europe was approaching, and Francis Joseph would discover that his record of sexual scandal, criminal exploitation, and failed rebellion had marked him as a liability that no institution could afford to protect. Military records document Prince Francis Joseph's service in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, despite his previous disgrace and institutional persecution. Contemporary accounts suggest the prince enlisted because warfare offered his only remaining opportunity to demonstrate royal courage and potentially restore some measure of honor through military sacrifice. The empire that had destroyed his career was willing to accept his service when it needed bodies for the trenches. Intelligence files from this period reveal the calculated cynicism behind Francis Joseph's military deployment. Austrian authorities understood that a disgraced prince with no institutional protection represented an expendable asset in wartime operations. Court records suggest officials expected his military service would either result in battlefield death or provide additional evidence of his unsuitability for any future royal recognition. What Francis Joseph likely never understood was how completely he had been abandoned by every institution that had once claimed authority over his life. Portuguese exile leadership, according to diplomatic correspondence, had written him off as a permanent liability. Austrian officials, court memoranda indicate, viewed his military service as a convenient method of disposal rather than an opportunity for rehabilitation. The prince's capture by enemy forces represented the final stage of his institutional abandonment. Military records show no significant diplomatic efforts were made to secure his release or ensure appropriate treatment as captured European royalty. Intelligence reports suggest Allied authorities were informed of his background in sexual scandal, criminal exploitation, and failed rebellion, eliminating any motivation to provide special consideration. Francis Joseph was imprisoned on the island of Ischia near Naples, where he joined other prisoners of war in facilities designed for common soldiers rather than captured nobility. Contemporary accounts indicate prison conditions were harsh, with inadequate food, medical care, and shelter that took devastating tolls on prisoner health and survival. The prince, who had once worn Austrian uniform with distinction, found himself reduced to the status of anonymous captive. Prison records preserved in Italian archives document the systematic neglect that characterized Francis Joseph's final imprisonment. Medical reports indicate he suffered from declining health that received minimal treatment, while correspondence logs show no significant attempts by Portuguese, Austrian, or other European authorities to monitor his condition or arrange for his protection. The complete institutional abandonment becomes clear through examination of diplomatic files from this period. Intelligence reports indicate various European courts were informed of Francis Joseph's capture and imprisonment, but made no efforts to intervene or provide assistance. The prince had been effectively erased from royal recognition while still alive. Contemporary prison accounts suggest Francis Joseph understood his situation with devastating clarity. Fellow prisoners, according to surviving testimony, described him as isolated and resigned, apparently aware that no rescue or diplomatic intervention would be forthcoming. The institutional support that protected other captured royalty had been permanently withdrawn from the prince who had lost everything. On June 15, 1919, Prince Francis Joseph died of heart failure in his island prison. Italian medical records document his death as unremarkable. Another prisoner of war who succumbed to the conditions and neglect that characterized military imprisonment. No European court claimed his body or arranged for royal burial befitting his bloodline. The prince, who had carried the heritage of Portuguese kings, died alone and forgotten, abandoned by every institution that had once exercised authority over his life. His destruction was complete, and the mechanisms that had engineered it remained perfectly intact. Austrian military archives contain carefully edited records of Prince Francis Joseph's service and dismissal, with specific language designed to obscure the sexual nature of his disgrace. Official documentation refers to conduct unbecoming an officer and indiscretions requiring disciplinary action without ever explicitly acknowledging the homosexual incidents that destroyed his career. This deliberate obfuscation represents institutional commitment to protecting Habsburg reputation while permanently destroying the prince. What makes these archival records particularly revealing is their systematic omission of crucial evidence. Intelligence files that documented Francis Joseph's relationships and surveillance reports that justified his removal were either destroyed or buried in classified collections inaccessible to future researchers. Austrian authorities understood that preserving explicit evidence of royal sexual scandal could damage institutional credibility decades later. Court records from the mental competency proceedings survive in heavily redacted form, with legal language that emphasizes psychological instability while minimizing references to sexual conduct. Preserved documents show how Habsburg legal systems created plausible alternative narratives for royal disgrace, allowing future historians to interpret Francis Joseph's destruction as medical rather than punitive. But intelligence memoranda, buried in diplomatic archives, reveal the coordinated nature of institutional cover-up. Confidential correspondence between Austrian, Portuguese, and other European courts shows systematic information sharing about Francis Joseph's conduct and agreement on methods for containing potential scandal. These records demonstrate how royal sexual transgression was managed as an international diplomatic concern. Banking records preserved in Austrian financial archives document the trustee arrangement while carefully omitting evidence of the surveillance and control mechanisms that made Prince Charles Louis of Thurn, Untaxis, an institutional informant. Financial documentation presents the arrangement as protective intervention rather than systematic imprisonment of a legally vulnerable royal. What survived in Italian prison records reflects institutional indifference rather than deliberate concealment. Francis Joseph's death was recorded with bureaucratic efficiency, noting his royal title while treating his imprisonment and demise as unremarkable wartime casualties. The complete absence of diplomatic intervention or special consideration was normalized through administrative language that suggested routine processing. Portuguese exile archives contain the most damaging evidence of institutional coordination. Preserved correspondence shows Portuguese royal leadership actively collaborating with Austrian authorities to ensure Francis Joseph's permanent exclusion from restoration planning. These records reveal how sexual scandal was used as a weapon for eliminating potential rival claimants to the Portuguese throne. Contemporary newspaper coverage from this period was minimal and carefully controlled. Press reports of Francis Joseph's military dismissal focused on administrative changes rather than personal scandal, while coverage of his later criminal exploitation emphasized his poor judgment rather than institutional abandonment that made him vulnerable to predatory targeting. Police files from the Vanderbilt swindle investigation survive in French and Austrian archives, documenting criminal methodology while avoiding examination of why a European prince lacked institutional protection from sophisticated fraud operations. These records treat his exploitation as individual misfortune rather than systematic vulnerability created by deliberate institutional isolation. The archival silence around Francis Joseph's final years reflects institutional success in erasing inconvenient royal lives. Records that survived were carefully curated to eliminate evidence of coordinated persecution while maintaining plausible alternative explanations for his destruction. But the mechanisms documented in these buried files remained active, targeting other European royals whose private lives threatened institutional stability. The systems that destroyed Francis Joseph were refined, not dismantled. Prince Francis Joseph's destruction was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern that European royal courts had refined across decades of managing sexual transgression among nobility. Intelligence archives from multiple European capitals reveal coordinated protocols for identifying, monitoring, and neutralizing royals whose private lives threatened institutional stability. The mechanisms that destroyed Francis Joseph remained active long after his death, targeting other displaced nobles whose conduct required containment. Court records from the early 20th century document similar cases across European royal houses. Intelligence files show Austrian, German, British, and French authorities sharing information about royal sexual scandal and coordinating responses designed to prevent destabilizing publicity while ensuring permanent exclusion from dynastic succession. Francis Joseph's case provided a template for institutional destruction that was systematically applied to other vulnerable royals. What makes this pattern particularly devastating is its precision. Diplomatic correspondence reveals how European courts identified royals whose isolation made them vulnerable to the same systematic persecution that destroyed Francis Joseph. Displaced princes, younger sons without inheritance, and royals dependent on foreign protection were specifically targeted for surveillance and potential elimination through manufactured scandal. Contemporary intelligence reports indicate institutional cooperation extended beyond Europe. American financial networks, according to preserved documentation, were warned about European royals whose criminal exploitation might damage international banking relationships. The Vanderbilt swindle that devastated Francis Joseph served as a cautionary case for protecting legitimate financial institutions from association with disgraced European nobility. Banking records from this period show how financial isolation was weaponized against multiple European royals simultaneously. Trustee arrangements similar to Francis Joseph's were implemented across various courts, creating legal frameworks for controlling displaced nobility whose conduct threatened institutional interests. The mechanisms of financial imprisonment were standardized and systematically deployed. Military archives document how sexual scandal was used to eliminate potential royal leadership during European political instability. Francis Joseph's exclusion from Portuguese restoration planning was replicated in other monarchist movements, where sexual transgression provided convenient justification for removing inconvenient claimants to contested thrones. Intelligence files reveal the long-term effectiveness of these institutional systems. European courts successfully eliminated multiple potential sources of royal scandal, while maintaining plausible alternative explanations for their destruction. The princes who were systematically destroyed appeared to have failed through personal inadequacy rather than coordinated persecution. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. What survived in diplomatic archives demonstrates that Francis Joseph's persecution established precedent for managing royal sexual transgression throughout the 20th century. Intelligence reports indicate similar surveillance and control mechanisms were applied to European royals during World War II and the post-war period. When displaced, nobility continued to pose potential threats to established political systems. Contemporary court records show how institutional memory preserved the lessons learned from Francis Joseph's case. Intelligence services maintained files on royal sexual conduct and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for neutralizing threats without generating public attention that might damage institutional credibility. The mechanisms that destroyed Prince Francis Joseph of Braganza were never dismantled. They were perfected. European institutions had learned that sexual scandal provided the most effective method for eliminating troublesome royals while maintaining plausible explanations for their destruction. The archives contain evidence of many more royal lives that were quietly erased using identical methods. Each case refined the institutional machinery that remains operational today, targeting anyone whose private life threatens systems designed to preserve power through systematic elimination of inconvenient truths. The prince who died alone on Ischia was not the last victim of these carefully hidden protocols.